Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we're going to be talking about something that I think a lot of programmers struggle with.
Yeah.
And that is when you're working with code, sometimes it gets messy.
Right. Oh, yeah, definitely.
And so the question is, when you are faced with a piece of code that needs to be changed.
Yeah.
And it's also really messy. Do you clean it up first or do you just like dive in and make the changes and then worry about cleaning it up later?
Yeah.
So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And we are going to be looking at some excerpts from a book by Kent Beck called Tidy First.
Okay.
And yeah, I'm really excited to dive into this.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
It's a great topic, and I think
Right.
it's something that a lot of people have opinions on, but Beck really lays out I think a nice framework for thinking about it.
Yeah. So maybe we could start by just like defining what we mean by tidying. Like what is tidying in this context? It's not just like, making the code look pretty right.
Right. Yeah, it's more about like small scale refactoring. So making these like little improvements to the code structure without actually changing the behavior of the code. It's like, if you had like a tangled extension cord under your desk and you're like, oh, this is messy. I'm going to just swap this out for like a nice power strip.
Right.
So it still functions the same way, but it's just like easier to work with and easier to understand.
Okay. Yeah. So it's about making the code like easier to understand and easier to modify later on.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. And I guess like, are there any particular like tidying techniques that like Beck highlights in the book that you found to be like particularly useful or effective?
Yeah. So he gives some good examples, like using what are called guard clauses to handle like edge cases early on in a function.
Right.
Adding comments to explain like the why behind the code, not just the what. And then extracting like repetitive code into helper functions.
Right. Yeah.
So those are kind of like three of the big ones that he talks about. Yeah. All things that I've definitely done before. But I never really thought about it as part of a bigger strategy. It was more just like, oh, this is messy. Let me clean this up a bit. But like, he's advocating for a more intentional approach, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it's not just about like randomly cleaning up as you go. It's about actually like making these decisions about what to tidy and when.
Right. And that's where I guess like the tidy first dilemma comes in, right?
Yeah.
So like the question is, do we tidy up before we make the functional changes that we need to make? Or do we just like dive in and deal with the mess later? And I mean, it's tempting to just like plow ahead, especially when you've got deadlines looming. I'll admit I've definitely fallen into that trap before.
Oh, yeah. We've all been there for sure.
Yeah.
But Beck makes, I think, a really compelling case for at least considering tidying as like an investment.
Yeah.
He kind of frames it as an economic decision where you're weighing the costs and the benefits.
Okay. So it's not just about aesthetics. It's really about like the long-term health of the code base.
But like, how do you measure that? Like, how do you measure the return on investment for tidying? It's not like you can track it in a spreadsheet or something.
Right. Yeah, it's not always like quantifiable. But I think you can think about it this way. If you're constantly battling like messy, tightly coupled code, it just slows you down. It makes it harder and more expensive to make changes later on. It's like trying to navigate a dense jungle with no clear path.
Right.
So tidying is kind of like clearing the way, making it easier to move forward.
Okay. So the return on investment comes in the form of like reduced future costs, like increased flexibility, and maybe a little less frustration for the developers who have to work with the code.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. But I guess like wouldn't that mean that you're constantly tidying, like even when it's not strictly necessary?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that kind of gets to the heart of like the tidy first dilemma. And Beck actually outlines a few different scenarios, and they don't always involve tidying first. Okay, I'm all ears. Let's dive into these scenarios because I have a feeling this is where people get stuck. Like when do you tidy? When do you not tidy?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about these scenarios. You said there are a few different scenarios that Beck outlines in the book.
Yeah, so he calls them, well, there's tidy first, obviously.
Right.
There's tidy later. There's tidy again.
Tidy again.
And then there's don't tidy.
Don't tidy.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's really like covering all the bases here.
Yeah.
So I guess let's start with tidy first. Like when does it actually make sense to tidy up the code before you make any changes?
Right. So I think tidy first makes sense when like you understand the code pretty well.
Okay.
You know what changes you need to make.
Yeah.
And it's clear that tidying up will actually make those changes easier.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, if you were going to start a big project at your desk,
Yeah.
you might want to like clear all the clutter off your desk first so you have like a clean workspace. It's kind of the same idea with code.
Okay, so you're like setting yourself up for success.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. But I guess like what about those times when you don't really know the best way to tidy up until you've actually like explored the problem a bit more?
Right. Yeah. So that's where Tidy later comes in.
Okay.
So sometimes you just need to like make some functional changes first.
Okay.
Just to kind of like understand how the code should be structured.
Right. So you're kind of like figuring it out as you go.
Exactly. And you might even realize that like some of the code that you thought you needed to tidy up is actually like dead code.
Yeah.
You can just delete it.
Right. That's always a good feeling.
Yeah.
Okay, so that makes sense. So tidy later is like acknowledging that you don't always have all the answers up front.
Right.
You might need to like experiment a little bit before you can really see the best way to tidy things up.
Exactly.
Okay. But what about tidy again? Like that one sounds a little repetitive.
Yeah. So it's not about like doing the same tidying twice. It's more about recognizing that like tidying is often an iterative process.
Right.
So you might tidy up a small part of the code while you're working on a feature.
Okay.
But there's more to be done in that area later. So it's kind of like, you're paving the path as you walk it.
Right. You're not trying to pave the whole road at once.
Oops,
You're just kind of like doing what you need to do to get where you need to go.
Yeah.
Okay. And then there's don't tidy. Like, is there ever a time when you should just like leave messy code alone?
Yeah. So, Beck actually argues that it's pretty rare to find code that will absolutely never change.
Right.
Like almost all code will eventually need to be modified in some way.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But he does acknowledge that if you're dealing with like truly static code, like code that you're absolutely positively sure will never be touched again, then maybe you can skip the tidying.
Okay. So that's like a pretty rare case though.
Yeah. I would say it's definitely the exception rather than the rule.
Right. Because even code, that seems like it's untouchable. Like you never know what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah, you never know when requirements might change or priorities might shift.
Exactly.
And what seemed like a dead end one day could suddenly become like a critical path.
Right. So even don't tidy is kind of a gamble.
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay, so we've got these like 4 different scenarios. But how do you know which one to apply in a given situation? Like, is there a decision tree we can follow? Or is it more of a gut feeling?
I think it's a little bit of both.
Okay.
So Beck encourages us to consider a few factors, like how well do you understand the code?
Okay.
How complex are the changes that you need to make? And then how much time and resources do you have available?
Right.
So those are kind of like 3 of the big factors that he says you should consider.
Okay.
But ultimately, I think it does come down to judgment.
Yeah.
And experience.
Right. And a healthy dose of pragmatism.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. One thing that strikes me about all these scenarios is that they all seem to emphasize like small incremental changes.
Yeah.
It's not about like tackling a massive refactor all at once. It's more about making these little improvements along the way.
Right.
Like you're tending a garden or something.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
Yeah. And that kind of ties into one of the core benefits of tidying, which is this idea of reversibility.
Oh, yeah.
So
reversibility is huge.
Can you explain what that means in this context?
Yeah. So, I mean, reversibility in software development is basically just like how easy is it to undo a design decision?
Okay.
So when you're making these small incremental changes, it's much easier to back out if you realize you made a mistake.
Ah, okay. So it's like having a safety net.
Yeah.
You're not making these like big irreversible leaps
that
could like send the whole project crashing down.
Exactly.
Okay. So that's a good thing.
Yeah.
But wouldn't that lead to a lot of back and forth, like constantly tidying and then untidying things?
It doesn't have to. It's not about like randomly tidying and untidying. It's about being deliberate and strategic in your approach.
Okay.
Remember that analogy of like paving the path as you walk it?
Yeah.
So you're kind of just like making these small reversible changes as you go. And you're focusing on the areas that you're currently working on.
Right. So you're not trying to like refactor the entire code base just for the sake of it.
Exactly.
Okay. But how do you balance that with like the pressure to deliver features quickly?
Yeah, that's a great question.
You know, like you don't want to spend all your time tidying.
Right.
And then not actually get any work done.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance for sure.
Yeah.
I think the key is to just find that sweet spot where you're making the code cleaner and more maintainable, but you're not getting bogged down in unnecessary refactoring.
Right. So it's about being mindful of like the bigger picture.
Exactly.
Like the project goals and the deadlines.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this is all really interesting, but I'm curious about this thing that Beck calls tidying chains. Like, what are tidying chains?
Tidying chains.
Yeah, what was that all about?
Right. So tidying chains are basically, it's this idea that one small act of tidying can often like reveal other opportunities for improvement. So it's kind of like, if you start cleaning out one drawer in your house, you might suddenly be inspired to like reorganize your whole closet.
Right, like one thing leads to another.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like this kind of like domino effect.
So tidying can be contagious.
Yeah. In a way, I think it can be.
That's interesting. But isn't there a danger of like getting carried away with that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you could definitely end up spending way too much time tidying. And Beck actually talks about this in the book. He warns against what he calls over-tidying, especially when you're like working on a tight deadline. Remember that analogy of like paving the path as you walk it? So you only need to pave enough of the path to reach your destination. You don't need to pave the entire forest.
Right, like don't get sidetracked by things that aren't immediately relevant.
Exactly.
Okay. But how do you know when you've tidied enough? Like, is there some kind of tidiness meter that we can check?
I wish. No, unfortunately, there's no like magic formula.
Okay.
It really comes down to judgment and experience. But Beck does offer a few guidelines.
Okay.
He suggests asking yourself a few questions like, is the code easier to understand now?
Okay.
Is it easier to change? Is it more robust? Like less likely to break?
Okay.
So if you can answer yes to those questions, you're probably on the right track.
Okay. So it's not about like achieving some arbitrary level of perfection.
Right.
It's more about like making the code like better, more manageable, and more enjoyable to work with.
Exactly. And I think it's important to remember that like tidying is an ongoing process. Code bases are constantly evolving.
Wow.
So there will always be opportunities for improvement.
So it's not a one-time task?
No, it's more like a habit.
Okay. A way of thinking about code.
Exactly.
Okay. We've talked a lot about like the technical benefits of tidying, but I'm kind of curious about like the human side of things. Like how does tidying affect teamwork, especially in the context of like code reviews?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think tidying can actually make code reviews much smoother and more productive.
Okay.
Because when your code is clean and well organized, it's just easier for other people to understand your intent and to provide like constructive feedback.
Right. It's like if the code is messy and hard to follow, it's like trying to have a conversation with someone who's like mumbling and jumping from topic to topic.
Yeah. It's like you're not even speaking the same language.
Right. Whereas like if the code is clear and well structured, it's like having a conversation with someone who's like articulate and thoughtful.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, there's nothing more frustrating than trying to decipher someone else's messy code.
Yeah. It's like trying to solve a puzzle where half the pieces are missing.
Exactly. Okay, well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. Any final thoughts for our listeners before we wrap up?
Yeah, I would just say, don't be afraid to experiment.
Okay.
Like, try out different tidying techniques, see what works best for you and your team. And remember, it's an ongoing process.
Right.
There's always room for improvement.
Awesome. Great advice. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Tidy First. We hope you learned some valuable insights that you can apply to your own coding practice.
It was my pleasure.
And until next time, happy tidying.